Welcome to the ID Den podcast, the show for teachers ready to step outside the classroom and into their next chapter. I'm your host, Charity Bosch, and I know firsthand how overwhelming it can feel to leave teaching behind. Whether you're exploring instructional design, navigating corporate culture, or just figuring out your first steps, this show is your roadmap. Each episode will tackle the real challenges, share practical strategies, and prove that your teaching skills are exactly what the world needs, just in a different setting. Let's turn that classroom expertise into your career advantage. In today's episode, I want to talk about aligning your learning outcomes to instructional goals. So this is often a challenge because new instructional designers struggle with backwards design principles because even though you've probably been doing it in the classroom, it is a new and unfamiliar topic for you. A common mistake that I see is starting with the content instead of starting with the desired outcomes and the goals that you have for the course. Also, corporate training often lacks clear learning objectives, which is where you come in as the instructional designer to help create those. Stakeholders will often request training without defining what the learners should achieve, and that's where you come in your expertise to help get that out of them. This particular challenge hits transitioning teachers hard because you are used to curriculum with pre-written standards and objectives. You haven't had to write those yourself very often. You have to know them and you have to know how to interpret them, but you aren't often writing your objectives. They are being provided to you. And classroom teaching often starts with the activities, not the outcomes. And that's how most curriculums are developed for the classroom setting. You also have never had to justify your ROI or business impact of learning. Your public school teacher, charter school teacher, private school teacher, your purpose is innate. Whereas in the corporate world, sometimes you have to justify the training and the time spent on it and the resources, including money, to develop it through business impact or ROI. ROI means return on investment if you're not familiar with that term. Corporate stakeholders also speak very differently from education administrators, and that can sometimes be a bit of a challenge as well. So, the real problem that we're facing here are that learning outcomes, a lot of times in corporate instructional design, are written for compliance rather than performance. A lot of the training that takes place in corporate world are for compliance purposes rather than development purposes, and so the learning outcomes are written for that. Whereas even when it comes to a compliance topic, we should be looking for performance or behavior change, and the learning outcomes should be written towards that. And so sometimes that takes rewriting those learning outcomes or reframing your thinking for them. Another part of the problem is that instructional goals are focused on covering content rather than that behavior change. A lot of times you'll be handed something and say, hey, make a training out of this. And it's a PowerPoint slide deck or a PDF of some sort. And you're trying to write learning outcomes to go along with that content rather than, hey, what is the problem we're facing? What are we trying to get people to do differently, and writing the outcomes and then seeing what content supports that. You're working the other way around and trying to fit outcomes into content that you've been given. Learners complete the training, but then they can't apply the skills on the job because the outcomes have been written for the content rather than the skills and behavior change performance that needs to happen. So it will benefit you greatly to master the skill of aligning learning outcomes to instructional goals, not your content. You can master that skill and create stronger portfolio pieces that demonstrate that instructional design thinking, which is a huge asset to an organization. It will also give you the ability to speak the stakeholder language about training impact because you're going to learn how to do that. More effective training programs that actually change performance is a result of mastering this skill. You're going to have better ROI, you're going to have better business impact because you're focused on that alignment rather than just the content. It also gives you credibility with corporate clients and hiring managers because you're able to speak to your value. And alignment is foundational for all your other instructional design decisions that you make throughout the entire instructional design process. If you don't have good alignment right out the gate, it's going to make every other step in creating a course more difficult than it needs to be. So let's talk about a framework that you can use for corporate alignment. Your first step is to identify the performance gap and the desired business outcome. There have been so many times where a stakeholder has come to me and said, we need a training on this subject. My very first question is, well, how do you know that we need a training on that subject? And it's not like I don't want to build it. And I'm like, well, how do you know you need that? No. Instead, it's starting the conversation of identifying that business problem, because I have found that a lot of times if you just go, well, what's the business problem that you're seeing? They don't know how to answer that question. And so you kind of have to coax it out of them. And so the first thing to ask is, oh, what sort of things are you seeing that you feel like we need training on this? And then they'll start saying, oh, well, these people are making this mistake, or we have this waste rate, or we have, whatever applies to whatever sector of the organization and industry that you're working in. But they'll usually start telling you these are the problems. And then once you have those problems, you can start identifying what sort of behavior shifts need to happen. Okay, great. Waste rate is too high. That is a big problem. Let's keep diving deeper. What do you think is causing the waste rate to be high? Because sometimes they'll come to you initially with, hey, I think we need a training on this topic. And through you coaxing the information out of them, you start to realize that maybe that topic is not what really needs to be the focus of the training, but instead it's something else. And so asking those questions, digging a little bit deeper, really getting it out of them to explain what the business problem is, how they know it's a problem, knowing how it's a problem helps you know what you need to focus on. After you have the gap identified and the desired behavior outcome shift that needs to happen through the training, then you can move on to step 2, which is writing the behavioral learning outcomes using those observable verbs. I will get on a soapbox on this all day, every day to anyone who needs to hear it. Understand is not an observable verb for a learning outcome. When you are writing behavioral learning outcomes particularly, understanding is not a behavior change. You're going to write outcomes that focus on how you can see that true change is happening in coordination with whatever business problem and behavior shift that needs to happen. You are not going to be using verbs like understand. That's just not going to happen when you are getting this focused on these shifts and not just trying to build knowledge. After you have your learning outcomes really solidified that are going to help you measure that, yes, as a result of this training, these things have been changing and this is what we can observe, which leads to how you prove your ROI and your business impact. Then you can move on to designing assessments that are going to mirror the real world application of the outcomes that you will use to say, this person has mastered this learning outcome and I have this assessment to prove it. After you have your assessments figured out, how you're going to measure that change, you'll work on the activities that align with the assessments. They're not going to be exactly the same as the assessments. One assessment might be built up from 3 different activity types. You want to really take something broad and break it down into smaller pieces. Taking that sort of form. So your learning outcome starts here. These are the assessments that we'll know. These are the activities that we can use to practice in order for them to be able to demonstrate mastery through that assessment. Once you have your outcomes, your assessments, your activities, Then you go to the content, the minimum information, to create instruction that is going to build towards them succeeding with the activities, which then leads to them succeeding with the assessment, which then leads to demonstration of mastery, which then should translate into their roles, into their job with behavior change in their day-to-day. Some common instructional design alignment mistakes are writing learning objectives that sound really academic instead of performance-based. When we are going towards behavior change and we want to see observable change within the organization, you can't be writing those academic verbs, learning outcomes. You have to be focused on performance-based behavior change learning outcomes. Another mistake is focusing on knowledge transfer rather than skill application. And a lot of times, skill application is going to require some knowledge transfer, but the knowledge transfer should not be the focus. The skill application and competency mastery should be the focus. The knowledge transfer supports that application and the behavior change. Another mistake is creating training that's interesting but doesn't solve the problem. You, of course, want your learners to be engaged and interested and participating, but all of that does nothing if it isn't actually solving business problems and leading to measurable change. And the final mistake is misunderstanding the difference between learning goals and business goals. Your learning goals are not going to be the same as the business goals. They are going to be different, and they are going to be written in a way to support the business goals rather than being necessarily directly tied to them. Now, the stakeholder conversation that you are going to need to have in order to get at the information you need to design effective content, application activities, assessment, to design and create those learning outcomes that are going to lead to behavior change. The first question, again, should be asking, what should learners be able to do differently after training? That is a key focus because a lot of times stakeholders are going to want to talk about the knowledge transfer. And again, the knowledge transfer is important and it's going to support it, but we are focused on what people need to be doing differently after the training. You want to make sure that you're pushing back on vague requests like, well, I just want them to be aware of this, so I want awareness training. It doesn't have to be a behavior change. It doesn't have to be some sort of skill competency. I just want them to be aware of that because the awareness isn't going to lead to anything and your ROI is not going to be very high with awareness type training. Instead, you want to push back and really get at, okay, that's great that you want them to be aware of what waste rate is, but I want them to know what they need to do differently to reduce the waste rate, as the example here. And so you can push back in ways that help you dig deeper. Okay, great. You feel like people don't understand what waste rate is. And sure, we might need to put that into the training to help build that understanding if we think that that really is missing. But at the end of the day, what do they need to be doing differently so that you can reduce your waste rate and know that they understand what waste rate is? You also want to help connect the learning outcomes to measurable business metrics. If you have something like a waste rate, which you don't have to understand what that is, that's a healthcare thing, particularly in blood banking, but waste rate is a metric. That is something that is trackable. So you want to help connect the learning outcomes to those measurable business metrics. Just understanding what waste rate is isn't going to lead to a reduction in waste rate. Instead, you want to focus on those things that people will do differently that will lead to a reduction in waste rate in that business metric that applies in the context of whatever you're working in, so that you can show your ROI and you can justify the training, but it helps also the stakeholders see the importance of it, and learning outcomes is very education. If you're talking to a CEO, learning outcomes is not their wheelhouse, but business metrics are. So if you can connect those outcomes to those measurable business metrics that are going to improve somehow through the training, that's something that they'll understand a whole lot better. You also want to make sure that you're documenting those alignment decisions for your portfolio and interview discussions. So in your case, you're probably not working on a project like this actively. And so you can kind of create a mock situation of this to then put into your portfolio. But you want to make sure that regardless of whether this is a one-off freelance project that you're doing or something that you're just artificially creating in order to support a portfolio, you have those sort of decisions documented, because portfolio pieces, the end result is great, but at the end of the day, what really matters is your process and your decision making that goes into creating that final output. Those are really important things to showcase in your portfolio and bring up during interview discussions. So how do you build portfolio-worthy examples? You're going to choose projects that demonstrate clear outcome to instruction alignment. You want to make sure that you are, again, whether that's through a freelance project or you're just artificially creating something, which isn't bad. You can just make things up. Well, not make things up, but create things without any sort of actual client or things like that for your portfolio. That's totally fine to do. But you want to make sure that you're choosing projects that are going to demonstrate the clear alignment when you do this. You're also going to want to talk through the decision-making process, not just the final products. So a lot of times, like when I am sending out portfolio pieces, if a client wants to see that, I will include what was the business problem, what was the impact as a result, and then I will kind of outline some high-level decisions that were made during the process in addition to the final product. Yes, I want them to see the final product. Hey, look at this amazing training I created. But I also want to provide some of that background information of why the training was created in the first place and what some of those key decision-making processes looked like during the creation of the training. You also want to make sure you show how you connected the learning objectives to the business needs, which again can be as simple as, along with the portfolio item, saying, this was the business problem. Here are the learning objectives that I created to support this business need. Here's how I measured the effectiveness of the training through these business metrics, and kind of connect the dots for them. You also want to make sure that you're including assessment strategies that measure actual performance change. So when it comes to training metrics, a lot of times you're going to see things like time to completion, average attempts before passing, things like that that are really focused on the training. That's not the kind of metrics you want to include in your portfolio. You want to include actual performance change metrics. Going back to my example of waste rate, which again, you don't need to understand what waste rate is, you just know it's a metric, right? And we'll just say it's a bad metric. If your waste rate metric is high, that's not a good thing. So if you were to create a training in this hypothetical situation for waste rate reduction, then you could provide metrics for waste rate and say, as a result of this training, after this training was provided, employees went through it, we saw a 10% reduction in waste rate. It was at 20 and now it's at this. It was at 30 and we cut it all the way down 50% to 15, whatever sort of change. Or sales training. Our close rate on our sales were 20%. After this training was provided, our close rate on sales went up to 40%. So we've doubled what we were doing before. You want to make sure that you have something that is tied to the business need that elicited the project in the first place to demonstrate that actual performance change. You want to see a change in those business metrics, not just, people passed the quiz with an average score of 97%. Like, at the end of the day, okay, great. But unless it's going towards actual performance change, that metric is meaningless. It's meaningful to you because if people are struggling to pass an assessment, maybe that is too difficult of an assessment and you need to go to revise that. But at the end of the day, what the stakeholders care about, what someone cares about during an interview, what someone cares about when they're looking at your portfolio is that there was an actual performance change that happened as a result of the training. So I know that was kind of a lot, might still need some delving into, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of why alignment is important and some ways that you can go about demonstrating that you at least understand what alignment is and why it's important and how you can showcase that within your portfolios, whether it's work that you have actually done for a client or some sort of professional development you built as a teacher for your building, whatever example you're going to use in your portfolio. You want to make sure that you're able to speak to those true changes because that showcases your value, that showcases the ROI and justifies why the training is important. Again, if you don't have any sort of experience and you're just creating portfolio items because you need them and you haven't had an experience and you're kind of just making things up or choosing topics that align with the niche that you're trying to get into, industry you're trying to get into, whatever, AI can be really helpful for this. See what sort of business metrics relate to the training that you're creating for your portfolio and see what kind of changes could happen as a result of that. You never want to say, especially if it's just something that you haven't actually implemented and you're creating to just have a portfolio piece, you never want to be disingenuous and say, oh, there was a 20% increase in sales as a result of this training, if there wasn't actually a 20% increase. You can frame it instead as this training could provide a 20% increase in sales training in an organization that is severely deficient in this area. You want to really phrase it as like it could happen, not it did happen, unless it actually did happen. So just be really careful with how you're wording things. You can still show how it could be measurable, but you never want to give someone the impression that you actually implemented a training that you didn't and you have metrics that you don't actually have to support that training. So hopefully this helps a little bit on learning more about aligning your outcomes to those instructional goals and to those business needs. Make sure that you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and share this podcast with your friends who are considering change. Make sure that you connect with me on Instagram at the ID Den. Alignment is what separates the real instructional designers from just curriculum developers, content creators. I will say I am not a content jockey. I tell clients that all the time. I'm not going to just take what you give me and turn it into a course. That's not my role as a real instructional designer, as a real partner for you and your business. I'm not going to just take things and plug it in and say, all right, job's done. That's not what real instructional designers do. Real instructional designers are going to analyze things and be very intentional on alignment and ensuring that any content that goes into a course is truly needed and purposeful within the course. This skill, getting this down early in your career, before you even have your first job even, is going to set you apart in this industry. Your practice for this framework on every portfolio piece you create is going to set you apart as you interview and get that first job. Get that second job if you've been doing freelancing, whatever stage you're in, the alignment piece is crucial for any successful training, and getting that down now is going to help you tenfold throughout your entire career.